It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 44. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we take a look at the recent headlines in the world of creationism. This week, we're going to talk a little bit more about Answers in Genesis, calling out something they call YoungEarth Evolution. So we're going to continue talking about Ken Ham and his organization, Answers in Genesis, calling out what he thinks is a problematic movement within young Earth creation, which he calls young Earth evolution. And then we have Terry Mortenson, who apparently has come out of retirement or semi-retirement to write an article that kind of goes along with the same theme of young Earth evolution, or the problem of evolution within young Earth creationism. And he's calling out theistic evolution, and he's calling out what he thinks is the real problem with theistic evolution. And we're also going to see an article in which we learn that supposedly organisms which can share genes with each other in order to give other organisms new properties they didn't have before, we're going to learn that that is not evolution. Let's talk about that a little bit. Also, Microraptors. ICR says they're just some kind of bird. Let's look at that just briefly. We've got all those topics coming up in This Week in Creationism, episode number 44. Alrighty, here we go. Let's kick it right off by going right into this young Earth evolution thing. You know that Answers in Genesis has published now 3 articles in a series of which they're calling Young Earth Evolution, in which they're bringing to the attention of their audience a movement within young Earth creationism they call Young Earth Evolution, or young Earth creationists that are too heavily influenced by evolutionary theory in the minds of Ken Ham and those at Answers in Genesis. In fact, they've now created a page on the Answers in Genesis website. You can see here, it's a special topic. Under the topic of evolution, they now have a subcategory called Young Earth Evolution. And as I've pointed out in the past, maybe I can't expect everyone's watched all my videos, so I just want to note that if you look at this picture, all right, depicting what they are thinking in terms of young Earth evolution, you can see that we have a land animal type organism that then is walking into the water, and then later has evolved into a fully aquatic organism, or a whale. And what this is alluding to is specifically a young Earth creationist named Kurt Wise, who is a really well-known young Earth creationist, but outside of the major young Earth creationist organizations, who has speculated at one time about the possibility that on the ark there could have been a land-dwelling animal that walked off the ark and had the capacity to adapt to living in the oceans. And so therefore, maybe whales or cetaceans had land relatives. And for Answers in Genesis, that's just too much evolution, or evidence that Kurt Wise is under the spell of evolutionary theory and is being too influenced by that. So we've talked about that before, and I'm sure this is going to come up again, because I'm sure that part of this series will specifically deal with the Kurt Wise, not only just this, but his other views of young Earth evolution. I thought here it would be useful to look at the text that goes with this subcategory. So if you go to this subcategory on evolution at the Answers in Genesis website, they have a short description of what they think the overall problem is, and then a series of links to the articles that will be coming out. So let me just read part of this, and I'm going to make a short commentary on it. A new wrinkle in sneaking evolution into the church is something we are terming young Earth evolution. Subtle ideas that don't comport with the scripture or are unnecessarily accommodating of evolutionary ideas are causing problems within the church, confusing the people in the pews. So they perceive that these individuals within young Earth creationism are spreading information that is contrary to what they view as the accepted truth of young Earth creationism. Right? They don't comport with scripture, so they're claiming they're non-scriptural in some way, and they are accommodating evolutionary ideas. Now, if you go back and watch my previous video, I make the point that I think that they're not accommodating evolutionary ideas any more than Ken Ham or the author of this particular article here on Answers in Genesis. Ultimately, this confusion can and has led to Christians leaving the church or questioning their faith or scripture. Issues such as feathered dinosaurs, walking whales, there's the walking whale thing, questioning God's method of creation, and other uncritical acceptance of evolutionary ideas have the average churchgoer scratching his or her head, and wondering whether there is truth to be found even in Scripture. So their concern is that this is causing confusion within the church. Shedding light. It's our concern that these ideas receive the scrutiny they deserve. All right? We need to shed some light on these individuals and these ideas and make sure that our followers see them for what they really are, so they can really be able to hone in on the truth and not be confused by these really false prophets, ultimately is what they're going to have to call them within the church. There is no reason, I'm just going to read the larger quote here because it's the money quote here, right? There is no reason and no real data to back up this claim to follow along with this evolutionary teaching unless you're imbibing the whole evolutionary scenario, which involves classifying dinosaurs and reptiles as birds. Once again, this whole consternation that Answers in Genesis has with this confusion of how we classify dinosaurs and birds. It just leaves me scratching my head why this has to be the most important example in their mind. Going against biblical understanding of kinds and the order of creation. The biblical understanding of kinds, creationists all across the board have all kinds of ways of understanding and describing kinds. It's an active area of, I'll say, research and discussion within creationism. And these so-called YoungEarth evolutionists are simply asking questions about how do we define a kind and actually proposing hypotheses. These are really big claims. They sound really significant. But when you look at Answers in Genesis and you look at how they understand a biblical kind and their own discussions in their own research journal and among members at Answers in Genesis, it's very clear that they don't have a well-resolved definition for what a kind is. There's nothing wrong with other creationists defining kinds or trying to figure out the definition of kind and coming to different conclusions. This isn't all about Answers in Genesis has the answers. Now, of course, they think they have the answers, but it's quite an arrogant viewpoint to suggest that these are settled questions, and therefore anyone who asks questions about them needs to be called out as a heretic. Dinosaurs and reptiles as birds. And once again, Answers in Genesis seems to be completely fixated on this dinosaur bird thing, and seem to think that just because other young earth creationists are willing to say that God created something that has dinosaur features and has similarity to dinosaurs, such that their general morphology could be considered dinosaur-like, but they also happen to have feathers as well. And so calling them a type of dinosaur or describe them as being dinosaurs with birds, that's not, I don't understand why this has to be something that they automatically are being compelled to do because of their beliefs in evolution. They simply believe that God created a type of organism that has dinosaur-like features and bird-like features as a separate created organism. That's not hard to understand, and yet Answers in Genesis implies that anyone that questions and suggests that there is an organism that has features of both somehow is fallen under the spell of evolutionary creation or evolutionary biology. Continuing. Going against biblical understanding of kinds. Biblical understanding of kinds, that's a highly debated subject. I just did another video on kinds and showing that even somebody who's written for Answers in Genesis is rethinking even what is the boundaries of a kind. To say that these individuals are going somehow wrong about what a biblical kind is when nobody has a definition of what a biblical kind is that is, I'll say, reached any form of consensus within the young earth creationist community, is a little disingenuous. And the order of creation. So this sounds really bad, right? This sounds like, oh, these individuals are far out of the pale, way outside of the accepted amount of variation that can exist within young earth creationism. And so be wary of these individuals. In fact, God said what he did in his word, right? God said it, he did it. We just read it and we know what happened. Genesis 1 and 2 clearly state that God created birds as well as sea creatures, including whales, on day 5, and land animals, which would include reptiles and mammals, on day 6. Now, what they're getting at here, what this individual, whoever wrote this, what they're getting at is, look, it says that birds, things that fly, were made on one day, and the reptiles are made on another day. It doesn't actually say reptiles, it just says land animals. Why can't you have an organism that can fly, that maybe God made on the 5th day? He made a flying organism that has many features of dinosaurs, toothed beaks and bony tails and certain hip structure and certain kinds of clavicle. And there's a bunch of different features that are more dinosaur-like than all the other birds that we have today. Why not say that's a uniquely created organism that has a mixture of features, and you could have made it on day 5 instead of day 6? How is this a heretical idea? How is this an idea that could only have come out of evolutionary theory? And therefore we need to cast aside these people that say this. This topic will examine the many ways evolutionary ideas are creeping into the young earth camp. And like I've said before, evolutionary ideas already affect and have affected the young earth creationist movement since the very beginning. And I don't know anyone within that particular camp that's not affected in some way by evolutionary biology and the findings of evolutionary biology. It's our hope that people will find the answers they need to combat these evolutionary ideas and to encourage them to find their answers in biblical scholarship, not in the words and ideas of fallible men. See, these fallible men implying that they're not really doing biblical scholarship. In my reading of the individuals they're talking about, there seem to be better biblical scholars, all right, than many of the people that answers in Genesis. We also need to guard against the ideas of men that would, perhaps even unwittingly, lay the groundwork for apostasy and uncritical acceptance of evolution as a whole. So these are big charges that Answers in Genesis is leveling. And this is on their landing page, basically, to describe young earth evolution. And now they're having a series of articles that describe and try to root out this dangerous line of thought that's within their community. All right, let's not belabor that point, because we're going to be talking about that a lot more when new articles come out from Answers in Genesis and addressing those. Let's go to Terry Mortenson. All right, Terry Mortenson is back. He hasn't written much for Answers in Genesis in quite a while. But he unloads this article, Theistic Evolution is Not the Real Problem, on February 1st, 2023. So this is right in between two of the articles in which they're talking about young earth evolutionists. At the same time, coming out with a volley against theistic evolutionists as well. So Terry Mortenson sort of leading the charge against that. And we're just going to look at one little snippet in there. So he's saying, so do you see the title? Theistic evolution is not the real problem. It kind of makes it sound like, oh, well, so what is the real problem if it's not theistic evolution? Or is theistic evolution not a problem? Of course he's going to say it's a huge problem. But the real root problem is not theistic evolutionist. It's actually old earth creationist. All right? It's the presupposition upon which theistic evolution is founded, which is the world is very, very old. That's a necessary requirement, really, for evolutionary theory, or at least a combination of evolutionary theory to the modern consensus view of evolution. So how does he put that? This view, theistic evolution, is heavily promoted in the USA in churches, seminaries, and Christian colleges by, and then he lists off a whole bunch of people, all right, well-known scholars, pastors, theologians, seminary professors, and so forth, and even different kinds of Christian book producers, right? Relatively conservative publishers. And all of these are publishing these theistic evolution tomes, all right, are sympathetic to theistic evolution approaches to understanding Scripture. So that's a big problem, right? Saying like, look how, the Christian community is being taken over by theistic evolution. And then he contrasts that with Crossway, on the other hand, published a 962-page response. I love how every time I hear about this book, all right, the book is Theistic Evolution, a Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique from 2017. Every single time I hear a creationist or somebody referring to this book, they always have to mention how big it is. Like, look, this was a lot of pages. And so since it's a lot of pages, it must be an amazing response, right, to this. It's 33 chapters, again, emphasizing, look, there's so many chapters. That's like so many different criticisms of theistic evolution. So how could it possibly stand, up against that? Helpfully present very strong reasons for rejecting biological neo-Darwinian evolution, including human evolution. In a 3-minute video to promote the book, co-editor Wayne Grudem, who's a seminary professor, lists 12 theistic evolutionist beliefs that are contrary to Scripture. I agree with him completely. All right, so Terry Mortenson says, these are really good reasons why we should doubt theistic evolution and reject the idea of theistic evolution. But, here comes the big but, right? What's really wrong with theistic evolution? It's really not the ultimate problem. The ultimate problem is the book intentionally ignores the question of the age of the creation, for the obvious reason that most of the authors accept the fact millions and billions of years of geological and cosmological evolution. All right, so here previously in the previous chapter, he listed all these different Christian authors, pastors, book publishers, and all that were sympathetic to theistic evolution. Well, of course, every single one of them is also sympathetic to an old Earth interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2. And then he goes on to say, like, well, here's this 33 chaptered volume, 962 pages, that's talking about what's wrong with theistic evolution, and that's great. I agree with some of their arguments. However, all of them are compromised. It's like all of those authors are compromised. They're compromisers too. I happen to agree with them on this particular topic, but they still have a very serious problem. All right. This book does not take a position on that issue, nor we discuss that at any point in this book, right? That's what they state in the very first chapter. However, I show in my in-depth analysis, which he did a big review of this particular book, that Grudem's 2 chapters in the book, he himself takes an old Earth position, even though they say they don't take a position in this text. And most every author clearly acknowledges an old Earth, or at least is kind of agnostic about it from that book. So what's really remarkable is here you have all these authors who are also, compromisers. The world of young Earth creationists and those who are in academia, right, in publishing, professors, pastors who actively think and work with the text of Genesis, there's not many of them that have a young Earth creationist view. And Terry Mortenson is pretty quick to point that. It's really remarkable. You can have so many people in the Christian community who are sympathetic to something like theistic evolution or evolutionary creation. And then you have this other group of academics and so forth who are writing against that. But the whole group of all of them, find an old Earth to be completely compatible with an interpretation of scriptures. That leaves Terry Mortenson, along with some of his friends, and a very select group of people that find the young Earth to be an essential interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2, upon which everything else is founded. And you can see that last paragraph. Theistic evolution is indeed a problem, but the problem is that any view of creation and the age of the Earth that denies some or all of the literal history of Genesis 1:11 significantly undermines the authority of Scripture and the foundation of the gospel. Right? These individuals, they can't be allowed to stand. They have to be called out as compromisers because they're undermining, all right, the authority of Scripture. And really, if we go back to YoungEarth Evolutionist or YoungEarth Evolution within their ranks, these individuals they're claiming are succumbing to the pressures of evolutionary biology, and they're coming up with alternative readings of certain portions of Scripture to try to understand what a biblical kind is and to try to understand how diversification might have happened and try to incorporate how appearance of age might actually be compatible with some aspects of cosmic evolution. All right. And because all those things have some of the trappings of like bringing things in that are not there, not the strict young earth creationist literalistic interpretation of Genesis, they feel like those are compromisers, right? They're compromising on the word, and therefore they're undermining the authority of Scripture. So they have to be called out, even though they are, by all intents and purposes, young earth creationists and would claim that moniker for themselves, that they believe in all the major tenets of young earth creationism. And yet there's still a danger. And if you undermine the authority of Scripture, then you're undermining the gospel. And that can't be allowed. All right, let's move on. Now, I'm going to take you to another website that I don't think I've done on the previous 43 episodes of This Week in Creationism. And I'll be honest, I don't look at this site very often. It's called Creation Evolution Headlines. I think it's crev.info is the address of it. And it's it is what it sounds like. It's headlines in, well, not really creationism. It's really headlines, scientific headlines with an interpretation, right? A spin, a young earth creationist spin on those particular things. If you go and look at the authorship on a lot of the articles, and in fact, if you look at who is the creator of Creation Evolution headlines, it's David Coppage. And he has done a number of writing of articles for Creation Ministries International, which is why I'm showing you his short biography there. He is worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he actually worked on the Cassini mission to Saturn not too long ago. And so astronomer would be his main area, or astromechanics would be his major area of expertise. But on this particular side, he kind of writes about everything, including a lot of stuff on biology. I pay very little attention to this site because I would say that it's whatever I say and whatever I've told you about Answers in Genesis articles or my critiques of ICR articles and how they very often misunderstand the original literature or are contorting it in certain ways that I find objectionable. I would just lose my mind if I had to talk about the interpretations of David Coppage of various articles, because they're kind of like it's like AIG times 5. The ridiculous nature of some of the logic and explanations he uses. It's just too much. And so it would be too easy for me to just, use their headlines and his words. I could make 100 shows on This Week in Creationism. I could have 10 shows a week on This Week of Creationism just based on those articles. But they're not looked at very much, and they're superfluous most of the time. And you can find that link at another site that I'm not sure that I've ever taken you to, but it's Logos Research Associates. Logos Research Associates is like, you can think of that as like an academic society, but an academic society for young earth creationists. So to be part of this organization, and this is this is an organization that exists apart from the major creation ministries like ICR and AIG and so forth. So there are members of all those organizations, plus professors at different Christian colleges and other independent researchers that all join this particular organization, Logos Research Associates. And the requirement to be in the organization is you have to have some kind of advanced degree in science. So they're interested in scientific creation science, not so much the other social issues and scriptural discussion. These are really the scientists talking about the science of creation science. It's not a terribly active organization. I can't really use this site in This Week in Creation much because their website gets updated once every 3 or 4 months. But you'll notice down at the bottom there, Creation Evolution headlines. That's because David Coppage is a member of Logos Research Associates and probably has something to do with the website. And he has a link to his own Creation Evolution headlines there. So just in case you wanted to go take a look for yourself. I just want to talk about one article that I saw. I'm including this on a list of things that I am generating to make a video in the future. And that video is going to be something like, I think the title will be something like, All the Things That Creationists Believe Aren't Evolution. And the point of that is going to be a long litany of things that creationists have claimed are not evolution. And once you read over that whole list, or once I go over the whole list, you'll start to ask, well, what exactly is left? Like, what exactly is evolution? After you find out all the things that creationists try to tell you are not evolution. And one of the reasons they're trying to tell you a lot of things aren't evolution is because they're kind of saying like, yeah, that does happen. Yeah, that does happen. That does happen. But it's not evolution, right? That's just reshuffling. That's just random variation. That's just, they have a lot of things that it just is, except that it's not evolution. So this was just a nice example of that. So that's why I'm bringing this one up. So and I happen to have seen the original research article that this was based on. So I knew right when I saw the title, I was like, oh, that's what they're going to do with this research. This is how they're going to get around this particular topic. All right, how they're going to explain away the thing I just read over here in the literature. So they have the title here by David Coppage is Gene Sharing is Not Evolution. Right? And then you see the subtitle there. Microbes in the ocean share genes in tiny bubbles. But where did the genes come from? What he's referring to here is a really interesting research paper that reveals a brand new way, describes a brand new way that we didn't know about before, in which certain kinds of bacteria can swap information with other bacteria. And they do so by packaging little portions of their genome into these little tiny bubbles that they sort of snip off in little plasma membrane packages, and then let them float out in the ocean. And then when these little plasma membrane bubbles, which are really literally like soap bubbles, right, meet up with another cell, they can fuse with that cell, and then the DNA, that little short strand of DNA, can be brought into that other cell and then incorporated into its genome. And so one cell can gain new bits of data, basically, from other organisms. And sometimes this includes entire packages of genes, where there's like a whole group of genes, and those genes are then inserted into another bacteria. And that bacteria then suddenly gains the ability to process, metabolize something that it couldn't before. And so this is a way that bacteria can share their genetic information with other bacteria. So if one bacteria comes up with new combinations of genes that make a new biosynthetic pathway, typically what happens is you can only inherit that by copying it and making new cells, right? But what about all the other billions of bacteria in the ocean, right, even of the same species, that haven't come up with that new package of genes? They're stuck without that capacity, right? And so typically what would happen is one lineage would have something and it would copy it over and over and over again in their descendants. And if those descendants were more fit for the environment because they now had a new skill that the other ones, that their neighbors don't, they would eventually supplant or replace all those other bacteria because they wouldn't survive as well. But a more efficient way of basically converting a species, basically upgrading a species and allowing more individuals to enjoy the benefits, right, of a new feature would be to horizontally share that information, right? It's called horizontal gene transfer. Now, we know of lots of ways that organisms can horizontally transfer information from one individual to another, instead of vertically transmitting it through time. But this is a new way, and it was shown that's super pervasive in the ocean, that there are these little tiny bubbles all over the place, basically moving and shuttling little pieces of genomic information back and forth. Right? So now the way I've described it is that you have a bacteria and it can receive information from another bacteria, and it can incorporate that information, the information being DNA sequence and genes in particular. And those genes can be incorporated into that bacteria, and that bacteria now has a capacity that it did not have before. I think that's a pretty clear case of gaining a function. Didn't have that function before, now it gains a function, now it can copy that function, and its progeny, right, the cells that divide from that, will now have the ability to do something it couldn't do before. Now, that sure sounds like a lineage which is gaining information. Now, this is something you can't say as a young Earth creationist. You can't have organisms gaining information because their mantra is that information is only ever lost, right? You can only lose information. God made all the original information, and from there, it's just being degraded through either genetic entropy or it's being lost in some fashion, and organisms are becoming simplified. They don't become more complex. But this is a way in which bacterial species can become more complex. They become more metabolically, they gain metabolic skills in this fashion. So now how do they get around this? They say, but where did the genes come from? Right? They kind of say like, oh, but look, where did the gene come from that this other bacteria now gained? Oh, it came from another bacteria. That means it already existed there. So they're going to say that, well, God made all those genes originally, and they exist in, this bacteria, that bacteria over there, and some other bacteria somewhere else. And all you've done is shown that they can now move those genes from one to another and like repackage them and make new combinations in other bacteria. That's just a fancy new form of recombination of the information that already exists. Okay. All right. I mean, like if that's what you want to say, great. But that is an evolutionary process, right? That is a mechanism for one bacteria gaining information and becoming better adapted in its environment than it was before. All right. You can continue to ask, like, where did the original information come? This is just what most young Earth creationists will do when pushed every time you come up with an example of how an organism might come up with new genetic information. Oh, you duplicated a gene. Now you have two copies, and you can use one copy to do the original function. The other copy could mutate and make a new function. Well, but where did you get that gene? Well, you copied another gene in order to make that new gene. I was like, but that's a new gene. It's new information. You're doing something new with it. And then the retort is, oh, but you started with a piece of DNA, and then it just copied that. So you have to have the original DNA. If you just kick that can down the road far enough, eventually you get to the origin of life, right? That's really all this is like, oh, you can show how these organisms are adapting and getting new genes and all that. But where did the genes come from? Where did the original copy of the gene come from? Oh, you can't explain that. So therefore, it's not evolution. Well, that's a particular definition of evolution. It's basically just saying evolution always boils down to the origin of life. That's where evolution is. That's what evolution is. Everything else is not evolution somehow. And that's going to be the point of my future video, because I'm going to list off a number of different things that creationists insist are not evolution. That any evolutionary biologist would say, that's just an aspect of evolution. That is evolutionary biology in action. That's what you're going to learn if you take an evolutionary biology class and you open up an evolutionary textbook. You're going to read about all these types of things that are happening and how they can help organisms adapt and change in their environment. So, but you're going to claim it's not evolution. All right, sorry. Going around in circles here, saying the same things over and over again. Let me read the critical line here. Another non-Darwinian mechanism has been found for how microbes in the ocean share genetic information. The article below claims this discovery helps our understanding of the evolution of bacterial genomes, but it actually has nothing to do with Darwinism. See, that's the real trick here. They're saying that evolution is Darwinism. They're equating those things as if, well, Darwin didn't come up with that idea. That's not part of Darwin's mechanism. That's not part of natural selection and vertical transmission of information, descent with modification. Yes, it is a non-Darwinian mechanism for how organisms can adapt and change. So they're saying it's not Darwinian. Therefore, it's not evolution. That's basically what Coppage is going to argue here. Gene sharing is not evolution. Why isn't it evolution? Because it's not Darwinian. So hence, Darwin is evolution. And anything that isn't exactly what Darwin said or predicted is therefore not evolution. They're just defining away evolution by constricting it to a very narrow definition. So it's either Darwinian or it's referencing common ancestry of all living things, right? It's either one of those two things. And if you're talking about anything else, you're actually not talking about evolution. Yeah, this article is really fascinating. Novel integrative elements and genomic plasticity in ocean ecosystems actually talks about how these little bits of pieces of cells that they can basically throw away, little packages of themselves out into the environment to be absorbed by other members of the community. And there's also at the same time they have the discovery that sometimes there are these things called what are they called, fake phages? I don't know what the name was exactly. Hijacked phages, right? You know, a phage is a virus that attacks bacteria, and so normally it would inject its DNA and then create a new virus and come out. But sometimes those viruses, when they get into the bacteria, and then they go to make a new viral phage particle and then store its own genome in the phage head and to escape the bacteria and infect another bacteria. In this case, the viral particle never gets its own genome back. What the bacteria does is it inserts, now what they found is they insert these little pieces of their own genome, their own bacterial genome, into the newly constructed phage. And the phage is just a protein machine. And then the protein machine goes out, and then when it connects, or when it interacts, when it comes into contact with another bacteria, the phage just automatically injects the stuff inside of its head into that other bacteria. In this case, it's injecting not a viral particle, it's actually injecting a portion of bacterial genome into that other bacteria. So that is yet another way that bacterial information from one bacteria can get to another. And we're not just always talking about from one bacteria of the same species to another as a way to help a single species adapt and change. We're talking too about one type of bacteria actually having some of its information transferred to another type of bacteria, which is then going to change the things that particular bacteria can do. That bacteria has evolved through horizontal gene transfer. It has gained new capacities and new abilities to work in its environment. All right, last story for this week. Let's go to Institute for Creation Research. Microraptor ate mammals, but was not a dinosaur. I don't have a whole lot to say about this. I'm just pointing out the ridiculousness of the fights that young Earth creationists have over dinosaurs and birds, and how they just cannot agree with one another about how to define a bird and a dinosaur. Most of them want to say that there has to be a distinction between the two. They don't want to have God creating something that's in between for some reason, which I still don't fully understand. But I thought this was I thought this one kind of took the cake, really. The recent claim of a near half-inch mammal foot in the stomach of a dinosaur, now dinosaurs in quotes there, is tainted by evolutionary dogma, right? So this sounds a lot like what Answers in Genesis is saying. Oh, look, evolutionary biologists made this discovery, and they feel, they have this assumption that dinosaurs and birds are related to one another, that birds are just evolved dinosaurs, one lineage of dinosaurs. And therefore, the way they talk about Microraptor, they talk about it as being a dinosaur that has bird-like features. And it's only because of their evolutionary assumptions. Again, I don't think you have to have an evolutionary assumption to say that, to look at a Microraptor and be able to just look at the different features and add up a list of features and go like, hey, it's got these types of teeth. It's got this kind of jaw. It's got this kind of, it has claws. It has claws on its wings, right? It has a bony tail, right? It's got all these different features that if you were to like have a list of features of certain kinds of theropod dinosaurs, you say like, yeah, it has a whole bunch of things in common with those. And so as if you were just to say like, how would you classify a dinosaur? Well, I got a whole group of characteristics, and if you share these characteristics, we're going to call you a dinosaur. All right, this thing shares those characteristics, so it's a dinosaur, or a type of form of dinosaur. But it also happens to have feathers and some other characteristics, which are characteristics that birds have, right? So it has characteristics of both, right? You simply can't claim that it is a modern bird, but Answers in Genesis and ICR wants to put it into clean categories, dinosaurs and birds. And again, I don't really quite understand, because it's not like dinosaurs are a big category, but it's not as if God had to make a specific dinosaur kind. No creationist believes there's a single dinosaur kind. At least I don't think so. They believe that God made a lot of different dinosaurs, different kinds of dinosaurs, and they're not actually related to each other. They just happen to have similar features. They're a common design. If you're going to make a common design of a dinosaur, why can't you fit into the common design some dinosaur kinds that share lots of characteristics with other kinds of dinosaurs? And this one just happens to have some extra features that are bird-like features. What's so horrible about that? So you look here and it says, all right, in fact, ICR scientists have concluded that the 3-foot-long feathered Microraptor was indeed just an extinct bird. And why? Apparently because it has feathers. And it could fly. And flying creatures were made on the 5th day, and so therefore it must be a bird. Except, of course, bats also fly, and so those are made on the 5th day too. So you could have bats that are unrelated to birds. Why can't you have, on the 5th day, created a type of organism that has features just like dinosaurs? You don't have to make all the kinds on the same day that have similar features, right? Except this thing could glide. It probably didn't fly that well, powered flight. And it could fly, and it had feathers, right? Why do you need to call it a bird? Why does it need to be called a bird as if it's like a bird kind? Once again, there's no bird kind. There are things that have certain characteristics that we lump together all in a nested hierarchy, and we call them birds. Just come up with another name for these, for goodness sake, right? Give it its own name, like synapsids, right? That are not mammals and they're not reptiles. They're synapsids. They have a heck of a lot of features like reptiles, though. And they have a lot of features that are like mammals. I don't hear any creationists objecting and saying like, oh, you're under the spell of evolutionary theory because you call a synapsid something that's in between a dinosaur and a mammal. We want to recognize that it's either a mammal or it's a dinosaur, a reptile. All right, you can't have anything between that has features of both. But they recognize synapsids are synapsids. They're separately created different kinds of synapsids that have a mixture of features that are mammal and reptilian-like. Why can't you have a reptile, bird-like creature? After all, I mean, I've heard YoungEarth creationists talk all the time about how a platypus is like a combo creature of many different characteristics, and it's just a special creation of God that is unique, and generally falls under the category of mammals because of certain features, but it has wildly different features. I just am perplexed by how upset creationists come or how much they feel they need to define every single fossil as either a dinosaur or a bird, and never can be anything in between. It doesn't make any sense when you have lots of different kinds of each, right? Because after all, every one of those kinds has differences between them. I mean, what's a dinosaur? It's just an artificial construct. It's an artificial construct based on our perceptions of similarities. And we give that group of things a name called dinosaurs. Yeah, can you tell I'm frustrated about the dinosaur bird thing? I'm just kind of tired of hearing about it. But I know that, all right, I'll shed a little sympathy for them. I know that their audience is really perplexed, right? Going back to what I was originally saying about the author of this, or the editor that's putting together all this stuff about young Earth evolutionists, right? And what is their concern? The conflicting information, right? The cognitive dissonance that some individual young Earth creationists are creating by saying that this thing is a bird with dinosaur features, or it's a dinosaur with bird-like features. And that's confusing. See, Answers in Genesis is all about having an answer, right? And what are the questions that they're going to be asked? They're not asked about the nuance of taxonomy and biological diversification and how there could be different groups that have different features that are really complicated to understand. They're never asked those questions by their audience, their general audience. Their general audience will ask them, is that a bird because it has feathers, or is that a dinosaur? And they've decided that the simplest answer and the easiest way to determine what a bird is, it has feathers. And so even though the Bible doesn't say anything about like how you define a bird, it doesn't say that birds thou shalt have feathers, or an organism that doesn't have feathers can't be a bird, right? There's no taxonomic information like that in the scriptures. They've just decided if it's got a feather, they're going to call it a dinosaur. And then they get all upset because there are certain things that clearly are dinosaurs, right? In all other features. And then somebody comes out with some evidence they possibly had feathers. And so what Answers in Genesis does is they go into full disaster mode, right? Where they're like, oh no, how are we going to explain this? Because we've been saying that if you have a feather, you're a bird. And so what they end up having to do is deny the evidence that some dinosaurs had feathers or feather-like things. So they say like, those things kind of look like feathers, but they're actually just keratin fibers that are not related to actual feathers, and they're not true feathers. They're similar to feathers, right? But they're not actually feathers, because they've committed to, if you have a feather, you're a dinosaur. They create so many problems for themselves because they want to have the answer, and they often come up with the answer way before they have the full body of evidence, right? They make proclamations. And then once they've made those proclamations, they work really hard to make sure that all the evidence continues to support their proclamation, no matter how ridiculous it starts to get. And that's something that, I'm still continuing here, but I'm generating, I'm drawing some connections in my mind, even as I'm talking through this. That's why these types of things help you. It really helps you think through these thoughts in this world. What's happening with the young Earth evolutionist, and one of the things that I've been saying that I think is different about what I call the new creationist, is they're not stuck on these proclamations that Answers in Genesis and to some extent ICR and CMI have made. Like, here's the answer for our audience. Let's make it simple. Here it is. These are the truths, right? We're Answers in Genesis. We looked at it. We solved it. Here's your answer. They're willing to come along and say, that's not what the evidence really shows. The world is a dynamic place. We're learning a lot of new things. You have to be somewhat flexible and say that we're wrong about that. And there's a better way of understanding this. AIG is generally just a lot less flexible. And they find that as intruding upon their turf and dangerous, right? Just the way it was described. You're creating cognitive dissonance. You're creating confusion in people's minds because you're saying that what we've already proclaimed to be the truth is not necessarily the truth, right? There's no scriptural absolutes in these areas, right? These are matters of discussion. These are matters of using evidence and the minds that God has given us to be able to figure these things out about his creation. And as we learn more about his creation, you should expect that that some ideas are going to shift in those areas. So it's best not to simply stand upon a certain rock, but find out that that rock is actually on, it really truly is on shifting sand, because it never was on a solid foundation of, like knowledge of the truth. It was always speculation, except you made it sound like it was truth. And there's so many things that answers in Genesis that are they're truly not resolved, and yet they make it sound like they're resolved. And that traps them into particular positions. All right, okay, I really do have to stop. That's This Week in Creationism. Thanks for hanging out with me. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.